The MAGA movement has been one of the single most dominant ideological factions in the Great Meme Wars, the war of ideas raging in our culture. However, I believe it is now inevitable that the MAGA meme complex is going to collapse. And in the wake of its destruction, a thoroughly transformed political landscape will emerge, with new political coalitions and alternative media being the single most influential force in shaping that new landscape. The reason I believe the MAGA meme complex will collapse is simple. The success of MAGA is dependent upon its opposition towards the so-called deep state. In particular, intelligence agencies and the military-industrial complex, and anything that has any whiff of being woke.
I am a cisgender millennial who's been diagnosed with generalized anxiety disorder.
And what's been made clear just recently is that the leaders of the MAGA movement are actively engaging in the same deep state behavior and victim-based identity politics that the MAGA base absolutely detests. This betrayal is perfectly illustrated by one of the most animating issues for the MAGA meme complex: the US government's relationship to Jeffrey Epstein. For the populist right, there is no greater archetypal representation of the corruption of the deep state than Jeffrey Epstein. While it's true that many freaks and grifters will use the whole Jeffrey Epstein issue to advance theories about flat earth and lizard people, it's not at all difficult to arrive at the perfectly reasonable belief that Jeffrey Epstein, quote, belonged to intelligence. After all, this was the exact phrase that former Labor Secretary Alex Acosta used to explain to the Trump administration why he gave Jeffrey Epstein such a lenient plea deal when Epstein was first arrested in 2008. Despite Acosta explaining to the Trump administration that he was told to back off from Epstein because the issue was, quote, above his pay grade, Acosta was forced to resign anyways in order to distance the Trump administration from the whole issue.
I do not think it is right and fair for this administration's Labor Department to have Epstein as the focus rather than the incredible economy that we have today.
It's quite clear that given that Epstein was tied to a shockingly large number of powerful people, if the Epstein files were to be released, it would implicate a large number of people within the US government and very likely many Trump allies. Even Nancy Pelosi's daughter recognized this back in 2019 when Jeffrey Epstein was arrested for the last time. So instead of doing the courageous thing and letting people know the truth about how deep the corruption goes, the Trump administration is already preparing people for the possibility that much of the information in the Epstein files will need to be redacted due to national security concerns.
What are the things that, and maybe some people don't understand the need to redact. In the case of a victim, that should be pretty obvious to people. What are the other things that maybe you would have to redact?
Well,
national security?
No, of course, national security, some grand jury information, which is always going to be confidential, but we'll see. Let's look through them as fast as we can, get it out to the American people, because the American people have a right to know.
Again, it's all very simple. The MAGA meme complex is fundamentally opposed to the deep state. Jeffrey Epstein is the archetypal representation of the deep state, and now the Trump administration is refusing to share the truth about Jeffrey Epstein. While this has and will continue to turn the base against Trump and the leaders of the MAGA movement, there is another self-destructive decision that the leaders of the MAGA movement have made, and that is the embrace of the utterly failed strategy of race-based identity politics. In an almost unbelievable display of incompetence, RFK Jr. made the following post on X from his official Health and Human Services account. Why is the man who was supposedly appointed to remove the toxic chemicals from America's food supply making public statements about how a particular kind of racism is, quote, a deadly plague? This tweet is almost indistinguishable from what Biden's CDC director Rachel Walensky said about systemic racism being a, quote, serious public health threat during the last pandemic. Race-based victimhood identity politics is a deeply pathetic and provably failed memetic strategy. And now, this attitude is manifesting in the Trump administration in one of the most deeply disturbing developments I have seen in recent history. And that is the enforcement arm of the permanent state arresting and threatening to deport Mahmoud Khalil, a legal U.S. resident, for, quote, pro-terrorist, anti-Semitic, and anti-American activity. It's important to note that Khalil has not been charged with any crime relating to the protests at Columbia University, of which he's associated with. It's very clear from Trump's words that Khalil's crime was supporting terrorists, which, may I remind you, is perfectly legal and protected under free speech. You are allowed to say, I support Hamas. And permanent U.S. residents, of which Khalil is, are entitled to exactly the same free speech protections that U.S. citizens are entitled to. This is all a victimhood-based excuse and effort to clamp down on free speech by the government under the guise of, quote, ending anti-Semitism.
We will no longer stand by while universities tolerate and facilitate anti-Semitism and support of terrorism on their campuses. Parliament's recent actions, which hopefully you've seen at Columbia University in coordination with our law enforcement agency partners, are part of the administration's mission to end anti-Semitism in this country. That investigation is ongoing, and we are also looking at whether Columbia's handling of earlier incidents violated civil rights laws and included terrorism crimes.
If this trend continues, then every person who tweeted something remotely in favor of Luigi Mangione could be arrested and convicted for supporting terrorism. And you can be certain that if the MAGA leadership continues to push for this disgusting level of censorship, they are going to collapse. Calling people anti-Semitic for criticizing the Jewish state or for supporting radical Islamic terrorism is probably correct. But if you're going to prosecute that as a crime, then you can bet that every MAGA person with even a remotely principled commitment to free speech is going to turn on the Trump administration very quickly. The other nail in the coffin for the MAGA meme complex is its ridiculous and unpopular attack on one of the only principled U.S. Republican congressmen left, Thomas Massie. Massie is one of 2 Republican Congress members who voted against the recent Republican budget resolution because it does nothing to address the deficit and the rapidly inflating national debt. And he might be the only Republican who is critical of the military-industrial complex and particularly Israel's influence over U.S. foreign policy.
By the way, everybody but me has an AIPAC person.
What does that mean, an AIPAC person?
It's like your babysitter, your AIPAC babysitter, who is always talking to you for AIPAC. They're probably a constituent in your district, but they are, firmly embedded in AIPAC. And
every member has something like this?
I don't know how it works on the Democrat side, but that's how it works on the Republican side.
The reaction to Trump's attack on Thomas Massie has largely been negative, and this demonstrates how Trump's ability to dictate where the MAGA movement is going is rapidly declining. The obvious factor that connects all of these reprehensible and ridiculous actions is the MAGA leadership's axiomatic and unshakable support for Israel. Jeffrey Epstein's ties to Israel are indisputable. The race-based assault on free speech is in direct response to the declining U.S. support for Israel, and Trump's attack on Thomas Massie are largely driven by the same reason. It's self-evident that the Trump administration believes that if they don't clamp down on or curb the growing disdain for Israel in the United States, then Israel's security will be put at risk. And one of the top priorities for the MAGA movement, or the MAGA leadership, is Israel's security. Just listen to Trump talking about his relationship with Miriam Adelson, which is a name that every person should know, as she was the single biggest donor to the Trump campaign with over $100 million in contributions. She is an Israeli dual citizen and widow of Sheldon Adelson, multi-billionaire and ardent Zionist.
You know, Miriam and Sheldon would come into the White House probably almost more than anybody outside of people that work there. And they were always after, and as soon as I'd give them something, always for Israel. As soon as I'd give them something, they'd want something else. I'd say, give me a couple of weeks, will you please? But I gave them the Golan Heights, and they never even asked for it. You know, for 72 years, they've been trying to do the Golan Heights, right? And even Sheldon didn't have the nerve. But I said, you know what? I said to David Friedman, give me a quick lesson, like 5 minutes or less on the Golan Heights. And he did. And I said, let's do it. We got it done in about 15 minutes, right?
Anyone listening to this knows that Trump is not lying here. He may sound like an idiot, but he is revealing the degree to which a citizen of a foreign country is directly exercising influence over U.S. foreign policy. This is the reason I am so radically opposed to Zog, our Zionist-occupied government. It is the motivating force behind these insane attacks on free speech, and it almost single-handedly dictates U.S. foreign policy. And as the MAGA leadership continues to elevate the interests of Israel over that of the United States, even to the point of threatening war with Iran, its mimetic power is going to decline, and many on the populist right will seek to form new coalitions. You know a sea change is in the air when libertarians and socialists talk about the possibility of joining forces.
So let's say one day there's a genuine anti-establishment party in the US and they win, and it's a coalition of progressives and libertarians. But the deal is, the libertarians get all the national security pokes, you guys get foreign policy, even the presidency, because the president does set foreign policy. That's really where they have the most leeway. But the progressives get all the domestic portfolios, and including at the top of our agenda is Medicare for all. Would you take that deal?
If you're telling me the trade-off is we have universal health care like a European country now, but we're not the world empire anymore, and we're not fighting wars of choice where millions of people are being slaughtered, yes, in a heartbeat, I would take that deal.
So, until then, good luck and Godspeed.